It is January 1887. A 23-year-old man named William Gentry stands between two freight cars in a Chicago and Alton railroad yard in Illinois. He holds an iron link in his left hand and a heavy pin in his right hand. The locomotive behind him is pushing 30 tons of rolling stock toward him at walking speed. His entire job is to guide that link into the slot of the approaching car, drop the pin through at exactly the right moment, then jump clear. He has done this 1,000 times before, which is why he is already missing 2 fingers on his left hand. The cars are about 4 feet apart now, then 3 feet, then 2 feet. Something goes wrong because the link does not seat properly. William reaches in to adjust it. That is the last decision he ever makes. The deadwood buffers slam together. There is no room for a human body in that space anymore. This was not an accident in the way we think of accidents today. This was a Tuesday. In 1887, this was just what the job looked like if you worked as a brakeman on an American railroad. If you somehow made it through 5 years without losing a finger or a hand or your life, your coworkers would look at you like you had just walked through a minefield blindfolded. Statistically speaking, 70% of all train crew members could expect to be seriously injured within 5 years of taking the job, and in some years, a full third of all brakemen in the country were maimed, or worse, in a single 12-month period. The railroad superintendents had a hiring trick back then that tells you everything you need to know about what this profession actually was. When a man came looking for work as a brakeman, the superintendent asked him to hold out his hands. He would count the fingers. If the man still had all 10, that meant he had never done the job before and would need training. If he was missing a few, that meant he knew what he was doing. Missing fingers were considered a mark of experience rather than a warning sign, because everybody understood that coupling railroad cars with the link and pin system was going to cost you something eventually. The link and pin coupler was the standard method of connecting railroad cars from the 1830s all the way through the 1890s. It was cheap to manufacture, which is why the railroads loved it. But the design required a human being to stand directly between 2 moving railroad cars while holding an iron loop in position and dropping a pin through a socket at precisely the right moment. The margin for error was essentially 0, because there was no buffer system and no way to stop the cars once they started rolling together. If your timing was off by even half a second, you were going to leave something behind in that coupler pocket. The iron link was kept deliberately short to minimize slack between the cars, which meant there was even less room for the brakemen to work in. The whole operation had to be done by feel because you could not see the socket while you were guiding the link into it. The locomotive engineer pushing the cars had no way of knowing exactly where you were standing, so every single coupling was an act of faith that the man behind you was paying attention and the equipment in front of you was going to behave the way it was supposed to. The brakemen called the space between the cars the deadline, and they were not being poetic about it. But the coupling was only half of what made this job into a meat grinder. The other half was stopping the train. Before George Westinghouse invented the automatic air brake in 1869, there was no way for the engineer up in the locomotive to apply brakes to the cars behind him. That meant every single freight car in the train had to be braked individually by hand. The brake wheel was located on the roof of each car. When the engineer blew 2 blasts on his whistle to signal a stop, the brakeman had to climb onto the rooftops of moving freight cars and run from car to car turning the brake wheels while the train was still rolling at 15 or 20 miles per hour. Picture this for a moment, because you need to see what was actually being asked of these men. A freight train in 1880 might be 30 or 40 cars long. When the engineer whistled for brakes, one brakeman would start from the front and another would start from the rear. They would run along the catwalks on top of the cars, leaping from roof to roof, turning each brake wheel with a wooden club for leverage. They had to do this as fast as humanly possible because the train might be approaching a station or a grade crossing or another train on the same track. All of this was happening whether it was July or January, whether the sun was shining or there was ice on every surface. The rooftops of freight cars in winter were covered with frost and snow. The catwalks were narrow wooden planks, and they became slippery the moment any moisture touched them. The cars rocked and swayed because the track was never perfectly level. At 12 or 14 feet above the rails were the bridges and tunnels. A brakeman running across the tops of cars with his attention fixed on the brake wheel in front of him might not see a bridge overhead until it was too late. There are stories from this era of men being swept off the roofs of trains by low-clearance structures they never saw coming. Railroads eventually installed telltales along the tracks. They were ropes or chains hung from poles about 100 feet before any low bridge or tunnel entrance. If a brakeman felt those ropes slapping against his back, he knew he had about 3 seconds to throw himself flat against the roof of the car, or he was going to hit something very solid at speed. The phrase "telltale" comes from an old expression railroad men used about their work: "Dead men tell no tales." That grim idea is exactly why the ropes existed, to give one last warning before you joined the men who could not tell their stories anymore. Tunnels were their own kind of nightmare because the smoke and steam from the locomotive would collect inside and hang there. If the train had to stop for any reason while it was inside a tunnel, the brakemen riding on top of the cars were breathing that poisonous air with no protection and no escape. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would take a job like this, and the answer is that for young men with no education and no other options, the railroad paid better than almost anything else available, and there was a certain romance to it, a certain toughness that came with being a brakeman. The men who did this work developed a reputation for being hard drinking and hard fighting, because frankly, what else were you going to do with your evenings when your days looked like that? The railroads knew how dangerous the work was, and they did not care, because labor was cheap, and there was always another young man willing to take a chance. The attitude of management was essentially that accidents were the fault of the workers who should have been more careful, which was a convenient position to take when your entire operation depended on men doing things that were fundamentally impossible to do safely. But the numbers got so bad by the late 1880s that they became impossible to ignore. In 1889, 1 out of every 35 railroad workers in America was injured on the job. For the men who actually worked around moving trains, the rate was 1 in 12, and 1 out of every 117 railroad employees never came home again. These figures were worse than the casualty rates in some wars. Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge stood on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1892 and said that railroad trainmen suffer as if they were fighting a war, and that the percentage of casualties, if not so high as with soldiers, is frightful enough. He was not exaggerating because the 8 years before the Safety Appliance Act saw more railroad workers injured than the total number employed in any single year. The workers themselves had started organizing in 1883 when 8 brakemen met in a caboose in Oneonta, New York, and founded the Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen. The only insurance any of them could get was through each other, since no company would write a policy for a man whose occupation had a 70% injury rate. The Brotherhood started offering $300 in benefits to the families of members who did not survive their shifts, which was a meaningful sum, when the job itself only paid $1 a day. A man named Lorenzo Coffin saw these numbers and decided that something had to change. Coffin was the railroad commissioner of Iowa, which was mostly a bureaucratic job that involved collecting statistics and writing reports that nobody read. But Coffin had actually spent time in the railroad yards, and he had seen what happened to these men. He had watched workers carried out of switching yards with their hands crushed into pulp, and something inside him refused to accept that this was just the cost of doing business. There were solutions available, and everybody knew it. George Westinghouse had patented his air brake back in 1869, and by the late 1870s, most passenger trains in America were equipped with it because the railroads could not afford the bad publicity that came with passengers getting injured. Freight trains were a different story because freight did not complain and freight did not sue. So the railroads saw no reason to spend money on air brakes for their freight cars when they could just hire more brakemen. And there was a coupler solution too, invented by a man named Eli Janney, who had been a major in the Confederate Army during the Civil War and afterward became a dry goods clerk in Alexandria, Virginia. One day while he was sitting in his shop, Janney clasped his hands together with his fingers interlocked and realized that if you could build a coupler that worked like two hands clasping, it would lock automatically when the cars came together and could be released from the side without anyone having to go between the cars. Janney spent his lunch hours whittling wooden models of his coupler design, and in 1873, he received a patent for what became known as the knuckle coupler. It worked beautifully, and the railroads looked at it, did the math, and decided that retrofitting all their equipment would cost more than just continuing to replace the brakemen who got mangled using the old system. This is where Lorenzo Coffin enters the picture as something more than just a bureaucrat. Coffin spent 6 years lobbying Congress almost single-handedly to pass a law that would force the railroads to adopt air brakes and automatic couplers. He was told over and over again that the federal government had no business telling private companies how to run their operations. He was told that the workers knew the risks when they took the jobs. He was told that progress would happen naturally through market forces if everyone would just be patient. Coffin refused to be patient because men were losing their hands and their lives every single day while Congress debated the finer points of federal jurisdiction. In 1887, Coffin organized a demonstration of the Westinghouse air brake on a 50-car freight train on a long downgrade outside Burlington, Iowa. The test was a success, and the railroad executives who witnessed it had to admit that the technology worked. They still argued that the cost of implementation was too high, and Congress still refused to act. It took 6 more years of Coffin showing up in Washington, testifying before committees, writing letters, and making speeches before the Safety Appliance Act was finally passed on March 2, 1893. The law mandated that all railroad cars and interstate commerce had to be equipped with automatic couplers and air brakes by the year 1900. The railroads screamed that this was government overreach and predicted economic disaster, and then they installed the equipment anyway because they had no choice. By 1902, the percentage of railroad injuries caused by coupling had dropped from 40% to 4%. Eli Janney never got rich from his invention because he had sold the patent rights years earlier for a modest sum. He spent the rest of his life on a small farm in Fairfax County, Virginia, tinkering with improvements to his design until he passed away in 1912. His gravestone in Alexandria reads, "His work was a benefaction which in itself will constitute his worthiest memorial." Lorenzo Coffin lived until 1915, long enough to see the transformation he had fought for become the standard across the entire American railroad system. The men who had called him a meddling fool and a socialist were now running railroads where a worker could couple and uncouple cars without ever stepping between them, and where a single engineer could stop an entire train with one lever instead of sending men running across icy rooftops in the dark. The brakeman position still exists today, but it means something completely different now. The job that those men did for 60 years of American railroad history, the job of climbing on top of moving trains and standing between rolling cars and trusting your life to your timing and your reflexes, that job is gone, and it is never coming back. 25,000 railroad workers lost their lives in the quarter century before World War I. That number represents fathers and sons and brothers who went to work one morning and never came home. Most of them are forgotten now because they were just working men doing a dangerous job in an era when working men were considered expendable. And the only reason we remember any of this at all is because a railroad commissioner from Iowa refused to accept that their lives were worth less than the cost of a coupler. The Telltales are mostly gone from the American railroad network now, those old warning ropes that used to hang before every low bridge and tunnel entrance. You can still find a few of them if you know where to look. Rusting posts with chains hanging down. Monuments to an era when the price of moving freight across this country was measured in fingers and hands and lives. Nobody builds monuments to brakemen, but maybe they should.